heard some pretty offensive talk since you've been home. But instead of getting on your charger and blindly striking it down, you turned and ran. You said, in effect, I don't like the way these people do, so I have no time for them. You'd better take time for them, honey. Otherwise, you'll never grow.
Ooh, that's not an easy quote to understand and to agree with, but nonetheless, that's a great quote taken from the novel Go Set a Watchman by Harper Lee. It was published in 2015, so basically it can't be said to be a 20th century book. But what you need to know is that it was actually written in the late 1950s. Harper Lee actually went to a potential publisher in 1957 with this draft. It was worked on for about 2 years and it became To Kill a Mockingbird. So the story actually takes place almost 20 years after To Kill a Mockingbird, but it was written before.
Okay.
That's why we are including it in our 20th century book quest. What did you think of this novel?
I found it extremely interesting and it made me think about a lot of things. I thought the story was okay in terms of plot lines and things like that. But the things that are talked about in this book are very interesting. And yeah, I loved it for that. What about you?
Just like you, I was not particularly fond of the narrative because not much is taking place in terms of actions, but very interesting, very good food for thought. Maybe not a book to read if you haven't read To Kill a Mockingbird.
Oh no, you
because
definitely
I don't
have to
think
read
it's
it first.
interesting enough in terms of plotline to be read like this.
Yeah.
However, when you have read To Kill a Mockingbird, it's an excellent way of thinking about the background in To Kill a Mockingbird.
So what is this book actually about?
You actually get to follow Scout, so the little girl from To Kill a Mockingbird, who has become a young woman. She's 26 in Go Set a Watchman. She's rarely called Scout anymore, but is called Jean Louise, which is her first name. She comes back from New York City for a holiday with her father, and we follow her for a week. And the story here is about Jean Louise realizing that her father is not the man that she had idolized as a little girl and a young woman, because she realizes that he is actually racist. So it's taking place in the late 1950s in a context when people are actively fighting segregation, and it turns out that Atticus is actually not in favor of the end of segregation.
I was very scared of reading this book because a lot of people talk about it, the way Atticus is this huge racist, and in To Kill a Mockingbird is hero, like a role model. So I was a bit scared of the way it was going to be presented. I would have been disappointed if it was like a complete 180 regarding his character, but I didn't think it was the case.
No, it's much more interesting than what I feared it might be, hearing all this on the novel. Okay, so first, let's talk about the main characters of the novel, maybe, just to make sure that everyone understands who is in the novel and who is not. Yeah. Because first important thing is that Jem is dead.
You are told this at the very beginning of the novel, and I almost stopped reading it. I was like, okay, it's already starting badly. And I thought it was interesting that she didn't kill him in the war.
No, he apparently just died of a heart failure or something.
Yeah. And there's also no more Dill. He's not dead, but he's
just abroad.
They didn't get married after all.
No, they didn't. No, yes, because that's one of Dill's plans when they're kids, that he intends to marry Scout, but that does not happen in Go Set a Watchman. Okay, so Jem is dead.
Yeah.
He's not a character in Go Set a Watchman, although we get flashbacks to their childhood and teenage years, and he does appear.
Yep.
So, main character, Jean Louise, she's 26, comes back from New York City for a holiday.
Yeah, she's quite independent. She didn't change much in that regard.
No,
she has her own mind.
Yeah, still this young woman who maybe wears more dresses but still struggles to be a lady, just as her aunt wishes she were. She is in love, or in a relationship anyway, with a guy who's named Henry, who's also 26, and Henry works for Jean Louise's father, Atticus.
He's basically his heir now that...
Yeah, professionally speaking, he is we understand the one who is going to
take over the practice.
And so there's the question of whether or not she's going to marry Henry.
Some people are for it and others are very much against it.
Yeah, because here again, you get the running theme of social classes that you already have in To Kill a Mockingbird, because Henry is no one.
Yeah.
He has no important family connections, no background, and he's had to work hard in order to become someone in the community, find a place for himself, and get a quite prestigious job, actually becoming a lawyer himself. So that's the position that Henry finds himself in. And so in Jean Louise's aunt's eyes, he's not enough.
No.
Not just in her aunt's eyes, actually. Her uncle as well thinks that he's not the one for her.
Probably for different reasons, though.
Yeah.
I would say.
But her family is not really supportive of their relationship.
Atticus is, though. Probably because he will take over the family
maybe. And also
business.
Because Atticus is seen differently by Jean Louise in this novel. But just as in To Kill a Mockingbird, he remains that man who doesn't have the same views as his sister.
That's true.
He's much more open-minded than her on the questions of social class and so on. So we also get Atticus in this novel. He's now 72, so clearly an old man.
He's ill as well.
He's suffering from arthritis.
Yeah.
And he sometimes appears as a decrepit old man.
Yeah.
Because sometimes his crises mean that he can't, for example, hold his fork and knife to have lunch.
Or lace his shoes.
Or drive himself to work. So he's more and more dependent on his sister and on Jean Louise when she's with him for the holidays. And we'll come back to this, but it's very interesting to have this decaying old man because he is very much a symbol of the Deep South. That is, I mean, this old Deep South and its values that are strongly challenged in this context of the late 1950s. Another character that we already had in To Kill a Mockingbird is Atticus's younger brother. But he takes much more place in this novel, and he's actually a very important character because he's the one who explains things to Jean Louise.
He's the author of the quote that we read at the beginning of the episode.
Absolutely. That's this character who says this to Jean Louise.
Is very important.
Yeah, and he's the one who helps Jean Louise come to terms with who her father really is. And finally, another important character in this one, Atticus's sister that we already have in To Kill a Mockingbird. She appears to have actually settled with her brother Atticus.
Yeah, but actually that's her one redeeming quality for me, because apparently they didn't live together when the kids left the house, but she came back to live with him when Atticus became too ill to live by himself, and by doing this, she allowed Jean Louise to stay in New York.
That's right.
Which I think is what Atticus wanted. So she made, I don't know if it's a sacrifice, but I feel, because she's a very, even more openly racist in this one than she was in the first book. Like when they have this group meeting with ladies and they are basically spewing racist garbage throughout the whole afternoon, and it feels like it's even more on the open in this book than it was in the first book.
That's right. I mean, I think that she can be considered as typical Southern lady because she is just living, it appears, to look good, behave well. Jean Louise at some point comments on her wearing a corset.
Yeah, and they say that she's the only one remaining like this in their town that went to a private boarding school when she was young, and that doesn't exist anymore.
So again, she's a symbol of the past, manners, being a lady, and so on. So the whole point in this novel is the issue of fighting segregation. The background is clearly the context of the Supreme Court decision of 1954 for the desegregation of schools.
Yeah, Brown versus Board of Education.
This is alluded to in the novel. And even the community in Maycomb has clearly split between, on the one hand, the black community and, on the other hand, the white community. The black community, it seems, have realized that the white people were not helping them. And they've realized that they really had to stand up for themselves if they wanted to achieve what they need, what they want, that is equality with white people and finding their place in the American society of the times. Even Calpurnia, who is a very important person for the kids in To Kill a Mockingbird, seems to have grown somewhat colder towards Atticus Finch. It seems that they still respect him, but they seem to realize that there is nothing much to be found in terms of support from white people, and they're actually right, because towards, I don't know, 1/3 into the novel, Jean Louise follows her father, who goes in secret to a meeting he has, and Henry is there as well.
Yep.
She hears her father introducing a guest who's going to talk on the subject of
Civil rights movement.
but to oppose it. And she's so shocked that she's actually sick, and she has very harsh words about her father, thinking that, I don't know if it's the word that she uses, but that he's actually a bastard and that she hates him.
Yeah. It must be even more of a shock to her coming back from a place like New York, and probably, I think, coming back after a long absence, you kind of have this vision of the people that you haven't seen in a long time, probably an idealized vision, and then to realize that they are actually not the way you thought they were.
So the reader discovers this new side to Atticus just with Jean Louise. I must admit that I was totally shocked to read this scene, and at first I didn't accept it. I really thought that it was a total misunderstanding, that there was something that Jean Louise as the narrator has missed, and I read on just saying, oh, that's interesting, what are we going to discover next? And he is actually against desegregation. This is not a mistake that the narrator makes. He is against it.
Yeah.
The whole point is to understand what his motives are. So it's with the help of her uncle that Jean Louise confronts her father and gets explanations on what his motivations are. And Atticus actually explains that basically what he wants to defend is democracy, and that to maintain democracy, you need to make sure that the people who are voting and making choices through vote are enlightened enough to make good decisions, which is actually an argument just to make sure that black people who didn't get proper education would stay out of democratic choices. Instead of, for example, saying, okay, they're going to get more voting rights, so let's make sure that they also have access to good education. So he is, in effect, a racist. There's no denying it.
Yeah, and like you said, like reading was made into a weapon against black people, because it was said that if you can't read, then you can't vote. But they made an exception for white people.
If your ancestors could vote before the Civil War,
Well, that's right.
then you didn't have to pass the literary tests. You were allowed to vote,
Yeah.
whatever your situation was, even if you didn't get good education.
Yeah, so his argument doesn't stand when you think about it.
So his argument is actually a repetition of the arguments that had been used for decades to prevent black people from getting voting rights. And we said it at the beginning, but he is actually the embodiment of this decaying Deep South and its values and its ethos of the South.
Yeah, the old guard.
Exactly. And he physically embodies it as a sick man, decaying old man. And we here get with the confrontation of Jean Louise, who's 26, living in New York, and her father, 72, old man of the Deep South, a strong opposition between the North and the South of the US and the younger generation.
Yeah. But what is hard to read for us reader is that he doesn't appear like this in To Kill a Mockingbird, which is even more shocking when you read his reasons and things like that in this book. But you kind of understand why he was like this in To Kill a Mockingbird if you think about it.
Yes, because as adults, which Jean Louise isn't in To Kill a Mockingbird, we understand that. Well, we'll go back to this.
Yeah.
So it's the main issue of the novel. Why is Atticus opposing desegregation? And actually the whole point for Jean Louise is to come to terms with this father that she had idolized so much that she couldn't see who he really was. And that's one of the themes of this novel. It's becoming adult. And by adult, it means a person who can see who their father really is. That's not a perfect being, but someone with faults. And actually, Atticus, in his perfect man's way, was expecting this. He was expecting his daughter
to understand. Yeah.
finally realize that he's not perfect. And there's one conversation when he tells his daughter that, or maybe it's her uncle who explains this to her, but actually it seemed to them that Jean Louise's own conscience was merged with her father's, and getting her own conscience would mean that she had finally become an adult, which is what happens in Go Set a Watchman. And she becomes capable of judging her father. So first she hates him, and then she finally at the end tells him, I love you. So in To Kill a Mockingbird, you have Jean Louise and her brother Jem losing some kind of innocence when they realize that Tom Robinson is not getting justice. And in Go Set a Watchman, she's actually becoming an adult and with her own conscience and being able to assess people's personalities. And another aspect that I really loved in this novel is being against bigotry, which is another lesson that her uncle teaches her towards the end, and which corresponds to the quote that we read at the beginning. It's that when you hear people saying things that you find, well, that you disagree with, or even find offensive, you should not decide that these people are not worth arguing with.
Yeah.
You should talk to them in order to understand their position, maybe. You don't have to agree with them, but you should not just wipe people out of your life.
That's what she wants to do at some point of the novel.
Exactly. You should not wipe people out of your life just because they say things that you don't agree with. And that's an aspect that is really hard to actually put in practice. Something that is really hard to do, because in the face of so much injustice, it seems pretty clear, at least to us in the 21st century, because we have to bear in mind that this was written in the late 1950s. So it's pretty obvious that it's impossible to accept such things, but it's also true that we have to live with other people, and that's what makes a community. And that's another of the ideals that are presented in Harper Lee's books that are worth bearing in mind. So the big question with this novel is, how can you explain the big difference between the Atticus of To Kill a Mockingbird and the Atticus of Go Set a Watchman? So first of all, the first explanation is that you have the editor's hand. So as we said earlier at the beginning of this episode, it was written in the late 1950s. Harper Lee went to her future publisher in 1957 with her draft, which is actually what we have now with Go Set a Watchman. She worked with her editor for about 2 years, and then it became To Kill a Mockingbird. So actually what we are reading is basically a draft, the draft of a novel. And from a literary point of view, we said it, but it's not the greatest novel ever.
But you also understand why this could not have been published in the late 1950s, because what she says about the South in this novel, she couldn't have published it during that time.
Exactly. It was probably not palatable. She would probably have been misunderstood from both sides, both from conservatives who had really hated the support of desegregation on the one hand, and on the other hand, the side of those in favor of desegregation who would probably have hated this sort of
understanding of both sides. So
I think that's one of the first elements to explain the difference. It's just that it's an earlier draft, and she worked on her characters, on her novel, giving them more background, because it's true that in Go Set a Watchman, the characters are not well developed. There are things that you don't really understand. What is Jean Louise doing in New York City, for example? It's not very clear. Second thing, we alluded to it, but the fact that she's an unreliable narrator in To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah, definitely. She's a child seeing her parent through the eyes of a 6-year-old. So, of course, she's going to see him a certain way.
And her father is the only parent she has left. So he's just her reference in her life. So the view that we have of Atticus in To Kill a Mockingbird is actually biased. So the fact that all these generations of readers have become just admirers of Atticus, some people even choosing careers as lawyers and so on because they had loved that character. Of course, it's a shock to actually realize that it was just the little girl's point of view of her father. So that's the second element to explain the difference between the two Atticuses. Third thing I would say is that To Kill a Mockingbird is set in the 1930s. Yes. It's not a time when giving more rights to black people was really a big fight.
No, and that's what you realize, because I kept thinking about To Kill a Mockingbird, he defends Tom Robinson. I don't think he thought he would be set free, but he really wanted justice. But when you think about it, like you said, black people had very few rights, and they were very much separated from white people. They couldn't have the same jobs. They had no money, no education. So they were not, for people like Atticus, a threat for them. So that's why it was no problem for him to defend them.
Exactly, because it was not a question of whether or not they would have a bigger place in society. No, it was not the point. They had jobs that were just their own, and they were not challenging the social order.
They were still picking cotton in cotton fields.
Exactly, yeah. And just like Calpurnia, for example, they worked in houses, but they were not lawyers themselves, and so on. So yeah.
Yeah, there was no challenging the status quo during that time, so...
Another thing that I would use to explain this big difference is that, again, coming back to Go Set a Watchman, it was a draft and the characters were not really well written yet, so it probably shouldn't have been published. Many people actually argued that it should have been left unpublished. First of all, because Harper Lee didn't want to publish it. Apparently, it was published with her consent, but when she signed the contract to publish Go Set a Watchman, she was already a very old lady, already almost blind. I think she was almost deaf as well. So some people questioned whether she really was in full possession of her capacities to agree to such a thing. The publication of Go Set a Watchman was criticized for being a coup to get money, basically, on the fame of To Kill a Mockingbird.
It's an interesting read. It makes for a more nuanced read of To Kill a Mockingbird, and it's really interesting. But I understand that a lot of people hate it for like the disillusion of a favorite character.
That's it. I would say that you don't have to read Go Set a Watchman, because from a literary point of view, To Kill a Mockingbird is the one that is the best, that's for sure. But if you want food for thought, then definitely pick Go Set a Watchman, because even if To Kill a Mockingbird is already quite good in that respect, Go Set a Watchman is excellent. I'm happy I read it.
Yeah, me too. And I'm not as traumatized as I thought I could be.
It's a slow burn, I would say. The beginning, I was a bit bored. Then it picks up when Jean Louise identifies her father's racism, and you get to try and understand who Atticus really is.
So thanks to all the people on Instagram who wanted us to talk about this.
That's right, because I was not going to read it. Having read negative things on this, I was not going to read it. And then when people asked, what do you think of this Atticus of Go Set a Watchman, then that's why I read it.
Well, thanks for listening, guys.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Hey, not so fast. Do you know what would help a lot? It's if you would leave a 5-star rating or even a comment on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That would enable us to help other readers find their own favorites. That's it for today. Bye.